The woman on Ethan Walker's porch didn't knock. She waited, arms crossed, sunglasses on, clipboard clutched like a warrant she had every intention of serving. Ethan noticed her through the side window as he zipped up his old camouflage jacket, the same one that had crossed deserts and borders, that had absorbed smoke and sand and the weight of nights no one talked about. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows, the patches faded from years of sun and sweat. But he wore it anyway. Some things you don't retire just because you're told to. When he opened the door, she pointed at his chest. "Take it off." No hello, no introduction, just that. Ethan blinked once, slow and measured, the way he'd learned to blink when someone pointed something at him and he needed time to assess. "Excuse me?" "That jacket," she said, her voice clipped and efficient. "It violates community standards." Somewhere down the street, a garage door paused halfway up. Curtains shifted in the house across the way. The neighborhood was already watching, already waiting to see how this would unfold. Ethan looked past her, scanning the street out of habit, then brought his gaze back to her face. She was in her 50s maybe, with hair pulled back so tight it looked uncomfortable. Everything about her seemed designed to project control. "This is my house," he said. She smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Not the way you think." Her name was Karen Whitlock, she explained, president of the Inside Community Homeowners Association. She stepped closer as she spoke, as if proximity itself constituted authority, as if standing in his space would somehow diminish his. Inside Community doesn't allow military-style clothing. It creates fear. It makes residents uncomfortable. Surely you can understand that. Ethan almost laughed. The sound caught in his throat and died there. "Fear of what exactly?" "Of violence," Karen said, the word rolling off her tongue like she'd practiced it. "Of aggression, of disruption." She paused, let the silence stretch. "Of you." The words were deliberate, crafted with precision. Ethan recognized the technique. She was trying to put him on the defensive, to make him explain himself, to establish that she held the moral high ground. He glanced at her clipboard, highlighted lines, red tabs, official-looking documents that probably meant nothing and everything at the same time. "You're saying my service makes people uncomfortable?" "I'm saying this isn't a military base, Mr. Walker. You're retired now. Perhaps it's time to act like it." Something cold and familiar settled behind Ethan's eyes. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was the quiet stillness that came before action, the space where emotion retreated and calculation took over. He'd felt it in villages at midnight, in rooms where the wrong word meant the wrong outcome. He felt it now, standing on his own porch, facing a woman with a clipboard and an inflated sense of her own power. "I'll take that under advisement," and he closed the door. The notice appeared before sunset, taped to his door with military precision, ironic given the content. HOA violation, non-compliant attire. The fine was small, almost insultingly so, $25 for a first offense, but the language beneath the number told a different story. Words like intimidation and hostile presence and escalation pending were scattered throughout the document, each one chosen to build a narrative, to create a paper trail that painted him as the aggressor. Ethan peeled the notice from his door, folded it neatly along the original creases, and placed it on the kitchen table. Then he caught a reflection in his window. A phone camera, the telltale glow of a screen in the fading light. Karen stood across the street, pretending to check her messages while her lens pointed directly at his house. Documenting him, building her case. Ethan stepped back from the window and allowed himself a small, humorless smile. She didn't know him. She had no idea what she was starting. At 2:17 in the morning, his doorbell camera sent an alert to his phone. Motion detected at the front porch. Ethan watched from his bedroom as the footage loaded, expecting maybe a stray cat or a raccoon investigating the welcome mat. Instead, he saw Karen. She moved with exaggerated caution, climbing his porch steps like a burglar, her phone in hand. She leaned toward his window, angling the camera to capture what hung just inside. His jacket, the unit patch clearly visible in the soft glow of the hallway light. She didn't know the cameras recorded audio, too. "Got you," she whispered, her breath fogging slightly in the cool night air. The satisfaction in her voice was unmistakable. Ethan saved the footage. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a phone he hadn't used in years, a burner, the contacts list short and specific, each name representing someone who had walked through fire beside him. He typed a single message and sent it to 5 numbers. "Situation developing. May need assistance. Will advise." The responses came within minutes. No questions, just acknowledgments, just readiness. Karen returned the next morning with reinforcements, 2 board members trailing behind her like nervous attendants, and a security guard who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Public theater, Ethan recognized. Witnesses, documentation, a performance designed to establish her authority. "Final warning, Mr. Walker," Karen announced, her voice pitched loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Remove the jacket from display or face daily penalties. The board has authorized escalating fines." The security guard avoided Ethan's eyes. One of the board members, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. Ethan nodded once, slowly. "Before you leave," he said, his voice calm and carrying, "you might want to consider something." Karen's eyes narrowed. "And what's that?" "Last night, 2:17 a.m., you were on my porch. My cameras caught everything, including audio. That's trespassing, that's harassment, and that's admissible in court." Karen's face flickered, just for a moment, before she recovered her composure. "Prove it." Ethan didn't raise his voice. "I don't have to prove it to you." 3 days passed. Ethan went about his routine, morning runs, afternoon repairs, evenings spent reading on his porch in full view of anyone who cared to watch. He wore the jacket every day. On the 4th morning, the community gate malfunctioned. Residents gathered near the entrance, confused and annoyed, as the mechanism refused to respond to codes or remotes. Then, the first black SUV appeared on the main road. It slowed at the entrance, paused, and rolled through the malfunctioning gate without difficulty. A second SUV followed, then a third. No logos, no plates that mattered to anyone here. 5 men emerged from the vehicles in coordinated silence. They wore civilian clothes, but everything about their movement, their positioning, their quiet awareness of sightlines and exits spoke to something deeper, something trained. Karen pushed through the gathering crowd, her face flushed with outrage. "You can't just enter a private community. This is a gated—" The tallest of the 5 men, broad-shouldered with graying temples, fixed her with a look that stopped her mid-sentence. "We're here for Ethan Walker," he said. His voice was calm, quiet, and absolutely certain. Karen opened her mouth to protest again, and then she saw the patches on their jackets, unit designations, service indicators, symbols that meant nothing to civilians, but everything to anyone who knew. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers and hit the pavement with a hollow clatter. The 5 men moved toward Ethan's house in loose formation, their presence drawing stares from every window on the block. Ethan met them at his front gate, and for the first time in weeks, his expression softened. "Hawk," he said, clasping the lead man's hand. "Didn't expect you this soon." Message said situation developing. We don't wait for situations to develop. The others, Reno, Dutch, Preacher, and Cole, spread out naturally, taking positions that covered approaches without appearing aggressive. They'd done this 1,000 times before, in places far more dangerous than a suburban cul-de-sac.
Karen recovered enough to storm toward them, her voice shrill. "This is a private community. You have no right." Hawk turned slowly to face her. "Ma'am, I've seen the footage from Ethan's cameras. I've read the violation notices. I've reviewed the harassment documentation." He paused, letting each word land. "You've been trespassing on a veteran's property, photographing the interior of his home, and weaponizing your position to intimidate a man who served his country for 23 years. Karen's face went white, not with fear exactly, with the sudden horrible realization that the narrative she'd been building was about to flip. Inside the HOA clubhouse, the board was fracturing. Mark Ellison, the thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, whispered frantically to Linda Perez, "Maybe we went too far. Maybe we should just drop this." Linda shuffled through papers with trembling hands. Every violation notice, every photograph, every email, all of it was potential evidence now, and she'd helped create the paper trail. Karen burst through the door, breathless and furious. "We're not backing down. He thinks he can intimidate us with his military friends. We have the rules on our side." Mark and Linda exchanged a look that Karen didn't catch or chose to ignore. The look said everything. Her ego had outpaced her judgment, and they were all going to pay for it. Officer Jake Ramirez arrived mid-morning, called by a neighbor who'd witnessed the confrontation at the gate. He was young, but experienced, with the kind of patient demeanor that came from years of sorting out disputes between people who should have known better. Karen rushed toward him before he'd even closed his car door. "Officer, thank God! This man has brought outsiders into our community. He's intimidating residents, "Officer," Ramirez interrupted calmly, "I'd like to hear from everyone involved." Ethan approached and extended his hand. "Officer Ramirez, I have some documentation you might find relevant." He handed over a folder containing printed screenshots, time-stamped footage, and copies of every violation notice. Ramirez flipped through the pages, his expression growing more troubled with each one. "This footage," he said slowly, "shows Mrs. Whitlock on your property at 2:17 a.m. That's trespassing."
Karen sputtered. "He's the one! The jacket! Community standards!" "Ma'am, wearing a jacket isn't a crime. Entering someone's property without permission and photographing the interior of their home is." Ramirez closed the folder. "I think you're the one who might need to speak with a lawyer." By noon, the story had spread through every group chat and neighborhood forum in the community. Phones buzzed with shared photos and videos. Residents emerged from their homes, watching the quiet standoff at the gate with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. Karen tried to rally support, shouting about rules and standards and the integrity of the community, but her words fell flat. The people who had once nodded along with her complaints now avoided her eyes. Ethan stood with his arms crossed, the team arrayed behind him in that effortless way that spoke of years working together. They didn't posture or threaten, they simply existed, a wall of quiet competence that made Karen's bluster seem small and desperate by comparison. She tried once more, pulling out her clipboard with shaking hands. "Fines! Daily violations! I have the authority!" "Karen?" Ethan's voice cut through her tirade, not loud but somehow impossible to ignore. "Look around you." She did, involuntarily. Neighbors stood on porches and lawns, phones raised, recording everything. The security guard she'd brought had retreated to his car. Mark Ellison and Linda Perez hovered near the clubhouse entrance, clearly calculating the distance between themselves and their president. "Your authority," Ethan continued, "exists because people agree to follow it. The moment you abused that power, the moment you decided to target someone for what they wore, for who they were, for serving their country, you started losing it. This moment right here, this is just when everyone else finally noticed." Karen's lips moved, but no sound emerged. For the first time, perhaps decades, she had nothing to say. The afternoon brought lawyers. Not Karen's, she hadn't thought that far ahead, but Ethan's.
A woman named Grace Chen arrived in a modest sedan, carrying a briefcase that contained enough documentation to bury the HOA in litigation for years. She met with Officer Ramirez first, then with Ethan and the team, then requested a formal meeting with the HOA board. Karen tried to refuse, but Mark Ellison overruled her for the first time in his tenure. "We need to hear what she has to say," he insisted, his voice steadier than it had been all day. "We need to understand our exposure here." The meeting took place in the clubhouse conference room. Grace Chen laid out the case with surgical precision: trespassing, harassment, abuse of authority, potential civil rights violations. Each point was supported by documentation, by footage, by timestamps that couldn't be disputed. "My client has no interest in destroying this community. He lives here. He wants to continue living here in peace, but he will not tolerate harassment, and he will not be bullied into abandoning symbols of his service."
Karen sat rigid in her chair, her face a mask of controlled fury. "This is extortion." "This is accountability," Grace replied calmly, "something this board seems to have forgotten exists." The vote came faster than anyone expected. Mark Ellison called for it. Linda Perez seconded, and within 15 minutes, Karen Whitlock had been removed from her position as HOA president. She didn't go quietly. She screamed about betrayal and cowardice and everything she'd built over the years. She threatened lawsuits and revenge and consequences none of them could imagine. But her words bounced off the walls of the conference room without effect, because the people who had once feared her no longer did. Hawk escorted her out personally, not touching her, just walking beside her in a way that made resistance seem pointless. At the clubhouse door, she turned back one final time. "This isn't over," she spat. "You think you've won, but you don't know what I'm capable of." Hawk regarded her with something that might have been pity. "Ma'am, I've faced enemies who could end the world. You're not even in the same category. Go home, get some rest, consider therapy." The door closed behind her, and the inside community began the slow process of rebuilding itself. In the days that followed, changes rippled through the neighborhood like stones dropped in still water. The violation notices stopped. The harassment ended. Residents who had avoided Ethan's house for weeks now stopped by to introduce themselves, to apologize for not speaking up sooner, to thank him for standing firm when everyone else had looked away. Mark Ellison took over as interim HOA president, his first act being a formal apology to Ethan, delivered in person and in writing. The board reviewed every regulation Karen had championed, striking down the ones that existed purely to control rather than to serve. The team stayed for 3 more days, helping Ethan with projects around the house, sharing meals on his back porch, telling stories that would never appear in any official record. They'd come when he called, no questions asked, and they'd leave the same way, quietly, professionally, with the knowledge that the bonds forged in service didn't dissolve just because the uniform came off. On the morning they departed, Hawk pulled Ethan aside. "You know, you didn't actually need us," he said. "You had the documentation, the legal case, the moral high ground. You could have handled this alone." Ethan nodded slowly. "Probably, but that's not the point." "Then what is?" "The point is that I didn't have to." Ethan looked at his brothers, loading gear into the SUVs with the same efficiency they'd brought to every operation. "The point is that 20 years after we stopped serving together, you still showed up. That's worth more than winning." Hawk clasped his shoulder, said nothing more, and walked to his vehicle. The 3 SUVs pulled out of the driveway in convoy formation, disappeared around the corner, and were gone. Ethan stood on his porch and watched the empty street for a long moment. Then he went inside, hung his jacket by the door where it had always been, and made himself a cup of coffee. Karen Whitlock put her house on the market 2 weeks later. The listing appeared without fanfare, and she was gone within a month,
relocated to a community 3 states away where no one knew her name or her history. Rumors circulated about what she was doing now. Some said she'd joined another HOA board. Others claimed she'd retreated from public life entirely. But Ethan paid them no attention. She was someone else's problem now, if she was anyone's problem at all.
The inside community continued its quiet transformation. New board members were elected, chosen for their willingness to listen rather than their desire to control. The gate was repaired, the common areas improved, and for the first time in years, residents actually looked forward to neighborhood gatherings. Officer Ramirez stopped by occasionally, sometimes in uniform and sometimes off-duty, just to check in and share a cup of coffee. He'd become something of an ally during the confrontation, and the friendship that developed afterward felt natural and unforced. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd just taken off the jacket?" he asked one evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. Ethan considered the question seriously before answering. "Every day, for about 5 seconds. Then I remember that giving in to bullies doesn't stop them. It just teaches them that bullying works." Ramirez nodded. "Fair point, though I have to admit, calling in a special forces team was a bit dramatic. I didn't call them in to fight. I called them in because I knew Karen would escalate, and I wanted witnesses she couldn't intimidate. The moment she saw people who wouldn't back down, who couldn't be controlled by her clipboard and her rules, her whole strategy fell apart." "Psychological warfare," Ramirez observed. "Hearts and minds," Ethan corrected with a slight smile. "Win the community over, isolate the threat, let the aggressor defeat themselves. It's surprisingly effective when you're patient enough to let it work." Summer faded into autumn, and autumn into winter. The first snow of the season fell on a quiet Saturday morning, blanketing the neighborhood in white and muffling the world into stillness. Ethan stood on his porch in his old camouflage jacket, coffee steaming in his hands, watching the flakes drift down from a gray sky. A neighbor walked past with her dog, waved cheerfully, called out a greeting that he returned with a nod. This was what he'd fought for, he realized. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic confrontations, but moments like this, ordinary, peaceful, unremarkable. The right to stand on his own property, wearing whatever he chose, and simply exist without interference. His phone buzzed with a message from Hawk. "Saw the weather report. You surviving out there?" Ethan typed back, "Barely. Send reinforcements." The reply came seconds later. "On standby. Always." He smiled, pocketed the phone, and went inside to start breakfast. The jacket stayed where it had always been, hanging by the door, a reminder of everything he'd been and everything he'd earned. Some battles were fought with weapons. Others were fought with patience, with documentation, with the quiet certainty that comes from knowing you're in the right. In some battles, the most important ones, were simply about refusing to be moved. The inside community had learned that lesson the hard way. Karen Whitlock had learned it harder. And Ethan Walker, retired soldier, patient strategist, and stubborn keeper of his own ground, had proven once again that the most dangerous opponent wasn't the one who shouted the loudest. It was the one who never raised his voice at all. Spring arrived with warmth and renewal, and with it came an unexpected visitor. A young man appeared at Ethan's door one morning, early 20s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was working up courage for something important. He wore a jacket similar to Ethan's, different unit, different era, but unmistakably military. Ethan listened more than he spoke, remembering his own transition from military to civilian life. The disorientation of suddenly being in a world where the rules were different and no one quite understood what you'd been through. "It's not easy," he said finally. "Some people will never get it, but you don't need everyone to understand. You just need a few who do. And you need to remember that what you did, what you served, matters, regardless of whether some bureaucrat with a clipboard appreciates it." Tyler left that afternoon with Ethan's phone number and an open invitation to return.
Over the following months, he became a regular presence, stopping by for coffee, helping with projects, slowly building the sense of community that combat veterans often struggled to find in civilian life. Other veterans in the neighborhood began to emerge from their quiet isolation, drawn by word of mouth and the knowledge that someone had their back. Ethan's porch became an informal gathering place, a spot where old soldiers could swap stories and find understanding without judgment. It wasn't what he'd planned when he moved inside community. He'd wanted peace and solitude, a quiet place to live out his retirement without drama or conflict. Instead, he'd found something different, a purpose, a community, a reason to keep engaging with the world even when the world seemed determined to push back. Karen Whitlock had tried to make him invisible, to erase the symbols of his service and reduce him to just another compliant resident. Instead, she'd made him a beacon. There was an irony in that, Ethan thought. The harder she'd pushed, the more visible he'd become. The more she'd tried to silence him, the louder his message had echoed. On the one-year anniversary of the confrontation at the gate, the neighborhood held a small gathering in Ethan's honor. It wasn't his idea. Mark Ellison and the new board had organized it, but he showed up because refusing would have been churlish. Neighbors brought food and drinks. Someone set up a small speaker playing classic rock at a respectful volume. Children ran across the grass while adults mingled and laughed. Officer Ramirez arrived in civilian clothes, shaking Ethan's hand warmly. "Quite a turnout. More than I expected," Ethan admitted. People remember who stood up for them, even if they didn't realize it at the time. Later, as the sun began to set, Tyler Weiss approached with a gift, a framed photo of Ethan's old unit, somehow obtained through channels Ethan didn't ask about. Hawk helped, said you might want this. Ethan looked at the faces in the photo, some gone now, others scattered across the country, all of them connected by bonds that distance and time couldn't break. He thought about the night he'd sent that message, the immediate responses, the way they dropped everything to come when he called. "Thank you," he said quietly. The party wound down as darkness fell. Neighbors drifted home, calling out good nights and promises to do this again soon. Ethan stood on his porch and watched the last of them go, the photo frame tucked under his arm. His jacket hung inside, right where it had always been. A symbol, a statement, a reminder of who he was and what he'd earned. Some battles left scars, others left lessons, and a few, the rare and precious ones, left something better. Proof that standing firm wasn't just about winning. It was about showing others that standing firm was possible. The street was quiet now, houses glowing warmly in the darkness, the community at peace. Ethan went inside, hung the photo on his wall, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He'd served his country for 23 years. He'd faced enemies on foreign soil and bureaucrats on domestic ground. He'd learned that courage came in many forms and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply refuse to move. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new neighbors, new opportunities to make a difference in small and quiet ways. But tonight, in this house, in this community, he rested. And his jacket hung by the door, exactly where it belonged.